Persuading people to take the actions we want can be hard. Our teams and clients are bombarded with thousands of messages every single day. But there is a way for you to get above the noise. Stories. This is the Stories with Traction podcast, and I'm your host, Matt ZAUN. Join my guests and me as we unpack the power of storytelling. We'll talk about topics like leadership, sales, and marketing, all through the lens of strategic storytelling. Enjoy this episode. Craig was wearing his blue Hawaiian shirt and khaki shorts. The last thing I saw was his back as he disappeared through the sliding glass doors. You never anticipate the images that will haunt the still, quiet moments of the mind. This will be mine. That is a passage from the book, Hope That Won't Die, A Survivor's Story. Now, when I read this book, I cried 3 times. The last time I cried 3 times reading a book was 15 years ago. It was a book, The Choice by Og Mandino. So if I'm going to cry 3 times every 15 years reading a book, I should probably get to know the authors of the book. So I'm so excited to have the authors of Hope That Won't Die on the show today, Craig and Karen Andrews. Welcome to the show.
Matt, it's such a delight to be here. Appreciate you and just the mission you have for telling powerful stories.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And the story that you shared in this book was so engaging, so emotional. Like, I couldn't put the book down. So I really wanted to unpack the journey with you, at least elements of the journey. I know there's many elements that you could share, but I just want to highlight a few things that I want a little bit more clarity on. And I think that your story will offer a ton of value to listeners in many, many different ways. So I'm excited to jump in. Where I want to start is where you begin before you even jump into the story that I really want people to recognize. You really talk about overcoming guilt. And I found this fascinating because I hadn't heard this perspective before, that because there are so many people that might be living with guilt based on similar experiences, they need to do potentially deep story work to try to unpack that guilt. So I want to start with this, is that as I read that, I was actually thinking about veterans that would return home from war and how they may be experiencing guilt. So can you briefly touch on the main aspects of the story, like the cliff notes before we dive in, and express why people may experience guilt as it pertains to stories of COVID?
Yeah, there's 2 types of guilt that we're dealing with here. One is survivor's guilt that I've wrestled with. And, there's 2 people that died. I personally know 2 people died while I was in the hospital of COVID. And for some weird reason, I lived. And I think that's something a lot of veterans struggle with. Dakota Meyer, not far from us, I know that that's something he's wrestled with because I've seen the markers on his website, the words that are spoken out of the pain of survivor's guilt. And Karen dealt with a different type of guilt of feeling guilty for decisions she made on my behalf when I was asleep and second guessing those decisions. Would you say that's...
Yeah, I really did, because I had to make some decisions quickly that I knew Craig wouldn't have wanted, but they were giving me, the medical community was giving me no choice and giving me no options. And so it's do this or he'll be dead in 24 hours. And so that's a hard choice to make, for sure. But at the time I thought, I've got to do this. I've got to give him a chance. But it was very, very difficult. And those choices meant a lot of suffering for Craig.
So this is absolutely fascinating to me because this is a massive event, culturally speaking. And it's amazing how there's a lot of people that are really trying to fast forward to the forgetting stage when it comes to this, which is just very interesting because, the Great Depression, another massive event, culturally speaking, had ripple effects for several decades. I remember my grandmother, it shaped the rest of her life. And it wasn't that they could quickly move on from that. And I feel like, especially based on what you're saying, I mean, everyone has their story as it relates to COVID. And there are millions of people that are living with guilt based on maybe decisions they had made in very quick charged circumstances. They had to make very fast decisions. So they could be living with guilt with that, as well as people that survived themselves. So what kind of message would you give to someone listening that may be dealing with guilt and maybe dealing with unpacking elements of trauma based on the COVID years?
Well, and let me ask you, what from your perspective, what's been helpful?
Well, Craig and I have unpacked this and unpacked this a lot and talked about it, which has been good. But it has been helpful for him to say to me over and over, you did the best you could. You did the best you could with the information you had at the time. And a lot of the doctors weren't giving informed consent. They weren't telling us a lot of things. And so we were having to make decisions really without all the information. And they would sometimes, it was very scary, and they would scare us. And so you're having to make decisions based on fear when you really don't know the truth. And so, but that was really hard. But Craig has said to me so many times, you did the best you could with the knowledge you had. You did the best you could with what you knew. And I think that's the case for most people.
And Karen has the advantage of me being here saying that to her. And there are people who are listening who lost a loved one. And I want to say to them, you did the best you could.
I think that's extremely powerful for people to recognize, and they may need to tell themselves that over and over again. I'm a huge supporter of counseling. So anyone listening that has any kind of story regarding trauma or guilt, I would recommend that they would seek, professional counseling, depending on how severe that is. So I appreciate you sharing that, Craig. And I'll share a smaller situation, I guess, in scale based on what you had experienced, but I still have a little bit of guilt myself with it, is that at the time, I have three children now, but at the time, one of them was on full Zoom school. Okay. And the area that I was in, it was quite a bit of time. Okay. So they were on Zoom school for over a year and a half. And what's interesting is we thought it was going to be, a month or two, and then it started to drag on and on. And my wife and I were in a state of chaos, right? Because my business radically changed due to COVID. My wife's work radically changed due to COVID. So we're just trying to survive so that one day, hopefully, we could thrive again. And thank God we're there now. But at the time, it was just survival. So my son at the time, who wasn't equipped to handle this, was really on an island all to himself. I actually processed this with another person on the podcast. It's the episode Navigating the Generational Shift. And we actually talk about what will happen to children that went through this. Real quickly, one of the things that she had mentioned is that kids that went through COVID as far as Zoom school, 100% Zoom school, she thinks will be very closely linked to Gen Xers. Were basically very, like, they were latchkey kids. They were very independent. They had to figure things out. So she had many similarities with Gen Xers, is what Generation Alpha, which is what my son would be in, will have that. But my point in saying that is that I've had to deal with my own guilt of he's isolated. He's having to try to figure this out himself. He's just constant negative messaging on the world is ending. Everything is horrible. We're in this hellish dystopian state. And as a very young boy trying to figure that out, and I don't feel like I was doing a good enough job with that. So I mentioned that because your story is very extreme based on what you went through, but there are other people dealing with guilt as well. Maybe it's not the capital T, but it's a lowercase t when it comes to that trauma. So I would also recommend to them to give themselves some grace as well. So I just wanted to make that point.
I was on a Zoom call recently with somebody who's a veteran, and he's actually coaching and counseling other veterans that are dealing with trauma. And I made a comment. It was a group setting. I made a comment. I said, look, I don't want to compare what I went through to what you went through in Afghanistan or Iraq. And I said, because it's not a comparison. And he replied back. He sent me a private message, and he said, trauma is trauma. So it's not like there's a capital T or a small t. Trauma is trauma. And that's said by somebody who's been in a war zone, who's shot, fired a gun in anger.
Wow. I appreciate you sharing that. Wow.
Mm.
So let's dive into let's give a synopsis of the story and then dive into certain details. So Craig, so you went to the hospital for what initially?
So initially, we actually both had COVID at the time. We had been sick for 11 days, and Karen was getting better, but I was getting worse. And I was getting to the point where I was having to gasp for air in between sentences. And I couldn't even finish a full sentence without gasping for air. And so it was clear, and my oxygen saturation had dropped down into the 70s, which is, for those that aren't familiar with the numbers, that's bad. Nurses would run into my room whenever it dropped below 86 and take immediate action. So the fact that it was in the 70s was really bad. And so that was it. I was having trouble breathing and it wasn't getting better.
So then you go to the hospital, and what did you think was going to happen when you initially went to the hospital? What was the ultimate goal going into the emergency room?
I didn't think I knew. I just knew that I had to go. And when I went in there initially, they said, well, hey, they stabilized me. They got my oxygen back up to a level at a low level of oxygen coming into me. And they said, you know what, we're going to order oxygen for you and send you home. And that's what I thought would happen. What ended up happening was a few minutes later, I had to stand up to pee. And when I did, my oxygen tanked and the alarm started going off. I couldn't bring I couldn't get my oxygen level back up. And so they had to add so much oxygen that there was no way I could go home on portable oxygen.
Wow. Okay. No, Karen, from your perspective, what were you thinking? What was the hope that he would be out within a day or two, or what was the hope initially going to the hospital?
Well, that's what I thought, is that he would be home in a couple of days. And I actually thought going to the hospital could potentially be a good thing, because they could give him, maybe there was some medicine they could give him, get him on oxygen, give him a little time to heal. So I actually thought, okay, this could be positive. He can be monitored and, he'd be home. I figured he'd be home in 5 days, max. And so I was upset they wouldn't let me in to see him, but we were sending videos back and forth and texting and whatever. And so at least that was something.
How long was it until you did come home, Craig?
3 months.
3 months. And what happened within, so take us through the journey, if you will. So within the first 2 weeks, what were the main elements that happened within those first 2 weeks?
Yeah, so those were hard days. I was on 15 liters of oxygen through my cannula, which is those little things that they put in your nose, and then 15 liters of oxygen through a mask. And when they would bring me a meal, I would have to get my oxygen level up as high as possible, then take my mask off and eat until my oxygen level dropped down, and I'd have to put my mask on, stabilize, and then finish my meal later. And a lot for 11 days, it was really focused on keeping my oxygen level above 86%. And a lot of it was a head game of trying to keep a positive attitude, because if I got anxious, then my body would, my pulse would increase, my utilization of oxygen would decrease, and it would cause my oxygen levels to drop. So a lot of it was just really trying to focus my mind. And there was one of the two people that I personally know that died while I was in the hospital. I knew was in bad shape in a hospital in California. And her name was Kristen Smith. I was expecting she would die any day. And I messaged Karen. I said, if Kristen dies, please don't tell me. I don't know if I'm in a mental place to handle that. I really need to focus on my own survival. And so that was it. The doctor would pop in for about 3 minutes a day. And, I describe in the book, he provided no hope and hollow insights, or vacuous insights. He would just kind of look and stare at me and nod and say, you're using too much oxygen. It's not getting better.
What was the midway point? So in the beginning, initially shock, you're trying to figure out this whole new hospital life that you're in, that you're stuck in. What was about the midway point in the journey? Was it just trying to survive the hospital at that point? Like what was the main focus about, let's say a month and a half into this journey?
Well, so for me, my awareness, I checked out on the 12th day. So on the 11th day, they transferred me to a different room with a bigger cannula that could deliver more oxygen, which that made me hopeful. I was like, hey, more oxygen. Because I just figured I just needed to wait out the disease. I needed to stay alive long enough for the disease to leave my body, and that'd be okay. But what happened was on the evening of the 11th day, they shot me full of morphine, which suppresses respiration. And at 12:30 in the morning, at the beginning of the 12th day, they called Karen in the middle of the night and said, we want to put your husband on the ventilator. And for me, things blacked out and I went into a dream state for another 6 weeks. But it was interesting when they called Karen, she heard me screaming in the background, no ventilator, no ventilator. They said I didn't know my name, but I knew I didn't want to be on the ventilator.
Yeah. And well, and that was what was so hard is we had discussed the ventilator. I didn't know it was coming. I thought we were still, he was still going to get better. I had no idea it was coming. And so it was really a surprise. And then to hear him screaming in the background, no ventilator, no ventilator, it really was awful because they're saying he'll be dead in 24 hours if you don't do this. And I'm like, what do I do? But I just couldn't, I just felt like I couldn't say no because I wasn't going to, when they tell you your loved one's going to die in 24 hours without this treatment, you're going to do that treatment. And so,
Sure.
And had I known what I know now, I would have made a different decision. But at the time there again, I did the best I could with what I knew.
Sure. And if that's what's being pushed on you and you're in a high stakes situation, there's a lot of moving parts, there's nothing but chaos happening. And someone in that professional hat, so to speak, is telling you something for sure, right? Because if God forbid Craig would have died based on you not doing that, there would have been even more overwhelming guilt. So I understand exactly where you're coming from on you made the best decision with what you had for sure. One of the things that I wanted to highlight based on what you said, Craig, is the dreams. This got me in the beginning of the book, right? I'll just read a passage. I crossed the parking lot, hoping to cross the gate into freedom, but the guard blocked me. He told me he was just following orders. You will be held accountable for what's happening here, I told him. Following orders has never been an acceptable defense. So I was actually getting pulled into different stories. And then at the end, I realized that they were just really real dreams. They were so real in your head. So I want you to speak to that because this is about midway through the journey, as you had mentioned, within this 3 months in the hospital. Can you just share with us what it was like from a dream perspective? And then, Karen, I want to ask you, how did you handle the dreams that Craig was receiving because they were so real? So Craig, can you just paint the picture for us regarding how real these dreams were?
Well, those were my reality. And I still remember those dreams in the same way you remember what was going on in your life 2 years ago. You probably don't remember your dreams from 2 years ago. I had no real life from 2 years ago. And so I remember my dreams. And what was really interesting was there were elements of reality that snuck into the dreams, things that were happening in real time that snuck into the dreams. And so at some point, I knew I had been sick. I knew I had to go through some recovery. But where they showed up in the dreams was like a completely different setting. For instance, the dream that you were referring to there, where I was trying to across the parking lot into freedom, that was a dream where I was in a dark room that was just kind of in shambles. It had wires and ceiling tiles hanging from the ceiling. There was junk all over the floor. And for some strange reason, I had a wooden shipping pallet on my back. And I'm just walking around this room trying to get out. A lot of my dreams, I had a wooden shipping pallet on my back. And a man came in and was walking around with me, but he was weak and he died. And he died right in front of me. And then a few days later, his family was out the window of the guard shack pleading for him to, where's our loved one? Where is he? We want to talk to him. And the guard was giving him nothing useful. Well, what was happening in the real world is somebody did die around me. The number of people that died in my dreams matches the number of people that died in the real world, most of them in the adjacent room. And what families were going through was exactly that experience. It's what Karen was going through. And that showed up in my dreams. And so that's an example where reality came in to my dream state. And I call them dreams, but they were sort of like a transient state, somewhere between lucidity and completely being blacked out.
Wow. So Karen, how did you deal with this? So Craig's experiencing these very real dreams. He's sharing with you things as if they happened in real life, and you know that it wasn't necessarily the reality in the room that was happening. So how did you compute the dream versus what you were experiencing?
Well, when these dreams were happening, he was in a coma. So, that part I didn't know. But what was so interesting was that he heard me talking to him. I had to fight to get into the hospital, and they would let me in 1 hour a day. And so every day I'd go in and I was praying over him and I was talking to him. I was singing to him. I was telling him what was going on in the world, just different things. And those were showing up in his dreams. So later then when he was, when he came to, it took him a while he was kind of fuzzy for a long time. And so he still thought those dreams were reality. And I was trying to be really gentle because not knowing, he thought that if I thought he was crazy, he would lose privileges, not be able to do some things, which was really funny. And I'm trying to be careful because I don't want him to think he's crazy. Saying some crazy things. And so I just tried to gently explain to him, and things like, he told me one time, he goes, well, he kept telling me he had been out of bed. And at that point he could move a finger and a toe. So, obviously that hadn't happened.
And a big pipe coming out.
And he had a trach out of his neck. But so when he told me, he goes, I've used my phone. I've been calling people. I've been doing work. I just gently handed him his phone. Well, he couldn't do anything with it. But that was the way of letting him know what reality was without making him feel, I didn't want him to feel bad, or I didn't want to shame him, I guess, in a way of, he was just waking up, and it was taking a while for things to make sense.
Wow. All right. So speaking of dreams, I do want to talk about the starvation piece in dream and reality. So you mentioned this in the book. You said in another 6 weeks, the quest for food became the center of every dream. And in response to me begging for food, I would be mocked and denied, both in my dreams and in real life. Perhaps there's some medical benefit to starvation that I still don't understand. That very last sentence, Craig, I actually laughed when I read that, not out of haha. It was almost like, because I immediately connected in my own life based on that sentence, because I too had been giving very bad advice when it comes to nutrition by actually 2 doctors specifically. Now, to their point, a lot of doctors don't get nutrition training the way that they should in order to share what a really good diet is. So I really empathize with that. And also, there's another story that I witnessed with one of my loved ones, where what they were given in the hospital actually would have had a negative effect based on the food they were given. So I think a lot of people have this reality. So I want you to speak to that, not only from the dream perspective, but in real life, what the starvation was like through this journey.
Yeah, so the part where you're quoting was when I was still in the emergency room and they realized they couldn't send me home, and they were waiting to put me in a room. And I'm sitting in there for hours. And I'm just starving. And occasionally a nurse would walk by and I would get her attention. She'd come in and I'd say, "Can you get me some food?" And she said, "Yes." And then would never come back. And this went on and I kept doing it, and would go on for hours. And eventually I noticed the nurses would quit looking in the room because they knew what I would ask. They would know I would try to get their attention. And later I was in the second of 3 hospitals. This was called an LTAC hospital down in San Antonio, where I was getting strong enough to go to rehab. And at this point, in my medical record, I'd been diagnosed as anorexic because they did starve me during the treatment. And Karen describes me, you say I look like a POW?
You did. And he was on a feeding tube at this point because obviously he'd been in a coma, so they had to put in a feeding tube. And I really believed they thought they kept telling me he was going to die. So I think nutrition, wasn't their main thing, but they were just not giving him enough nutrition. I had begged them to give him vitamins and they wouldn't do that either. And so, but I didn't realize how bad it was. He did look like somebody from a POW camp, but I didn't realize how bad it was until he started to wake up and
Well, and the nurse came into the room and she looks at me. I don't remember this. Karen remembers this. Nurse comes in the room, looks at me, face sunken in, emaciated, and she asks a guy with a trach who can't talk, says, "Can I get you anything?" And I look up at the nurse and I mouth, "Food." And the nurse laughs and like, "Oh, we can't get you food," and leaves the room.
Well, and I kind of thought he at this point was having some of these things that weren't reality. So I thought, oh, he wants a burger and he doesn't know he can't eat. But then but when she walked out, he looked over at me and he mouthed, "I'm starving." And I knew at that point, I thought, oh my gosh. So I immediately got the nutritionist at the LTAC to come in. And he said he's starving. And I said, he's lost so much weight. Is there something we can do? And she said, oh, sure. And they immediately upped his the food he was getting, the nutrition he was getting in his feeding tube. And that took, that helped. I can't figure out why they hadn't done that before then. He'd lost 40 pounds and why nobody noticed, that could be a problem. And I think that also wasn't helping his mental capacities come back. He was starving.
And to tap back into your question about dreams, what was happening in the dream world was people would show up, including Karen, and I was negotiating for food. In my dreams, I was actively negotiating for food, trying to get somebody to feed me. And when this thing happened with the nurse and Karen got they upped the slurry that they were pumping in my stomach, those dreams disappeared. They stopped. But here's what's really scary about that. I was barely alive. And there were two paths for me. One was get stronger and live, or get weaker and die. And at that crossroads, the scary thing is, if Karen hadn't been there, I don't think I'd be here today.
Wow. So speaking of support from Karen, obviously, and it's amazing what you went through reading this book, Karen. But speaking of support, not only with Karen, but where I became very emotional in this story was the rally of friends, of family, just kind of seeing it all pull together. So, and that truly exudes hope that won't die. So Karen, can you take us through at one point where what was family and friends really rallied to come to your side and help with this? Was it halfway through the journey? What stage would this have been?
Well, from the beginning, I had so much support from family and friends as far as in our church, as far as praying for Craig. When he went on the ventilator, the night he went on the ventilator, I asked the doctor, I said, how many survivors have you had? And he said, none. And so I knew this was a death sentence. Even, putting him on the ventilator was as much of a death sentence as not, but I had to give him a chance. So I texted. So that night I stayed up all night, just frantic, not knowing what to do and knowing that he probably wasn't coming home. Well, the next morning I texted my neighbor and I said, Craig's not coming home. They've put him on the ventilator. And this was like at 6:30. Immediately she was at my front door and she just came in the door and cried with me and just loved on me. And then she said, you've got to get your family here. And my first thought was, oh no, I don't want to bother them, whatever. And she just looked at me and she said, no, you've got to get your sons here, And so I decided, I let some friends know. They immediately came over and sat with me. Then later that day, I let my son know, and both my sons know, and one of my sons who lives just 2 hours away came and stayed with me for a week. And then I let Craig's brother and sister-in-law know because we're very close to them. And they texted me and said, we're coming. And they live in Maryland. And so, or I guess at the time they were in West Virginia, were they?
One or the other.
Yeah,
I mean,
were in Maryland.
they were in West Virginia. They can see Maryland from their living room.
That's right. So anyway, and so they said, we're going to come down. And I said, guys, there's nothing much you can, do. Wait for the funeral. And his brother said, we're not coming for Craig. We're coming for you. And they came down for 2 weeks. They both had to work. So they set up in Craig's office and in the dining room. And his brother would drive me to the hospital to see Craig. He would, they were just there. They made sure I ate. They just took care of things. And my son was here and he was helping me figure out things, what we wanted to do and different things. It was amazing. And then my church was so supportive and they were just loving on me. And my neighborhood, I got so much food between my church and my neighborhood that I was putting it in my neighbor's garage fridge and asking them to eat it because I couldn't get to it fast enough. I was so blessed. It was amazing. God just was taking such good care of me.
Wow. So, Craig, I have a question for you. So, you're a businessman. I've mentioned your most recent book regarding sales fundamentally changed my business. I even was complaining to you the other day that I have problems now in my business that too much is coming in. So I'm in a major growth stage right now where the concepts you taught, I'm at a point where it's an awesome problem to have, right? My team's growing, different things are happening. So clearly you want success for your clients. You want to, you offer a lot to the world around you regarding teaching business owners how to grow. So based on what we just heard regarding friendships, how did this change your perspective on still going after goals, achieving more from a business capacity, but also the friendship and family dynamic? Was there a priority shift once you got out of this? How do you handle both worlds?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a question I get asked a lot. One of the things about 2 weeks after I woke up, Karen started telling me what had been going on with business. And what I realized is that my team ran the business without me. And freelancers have reached out to my team and said, we will do whatever's necessary as long as Craig's in the hospital. Now, here's the thing that's so amazing about that. As Karen said, they thought I was a dead man. They weren't running the business, they weren't performing because they were afraid how I would respond when I came back. They didn't think I was coming back. They ran the business as if it were their own because it was the right thing to do. And because of the relationships that we built over years. So in many ways, from the business side, it was kind of affirmation of priorities I had set, that being very relational in business, relational with employees, relational with clients. I had clients visit me in the hospital. And so from that perspective, it was very affirming. And I would say it was less about change. It was more about, okay, you were doing the right thing, do more of it. And where I would say there was more change, anybody that's been married has gotten in these stupid fights with the spouse and fretted over things. And I think that's been realigning for us to realize, okay, maybe that's not worth fighting over as much as we previously thought it was.
Karen, how did it change your perspective regarding relationships?
One, I guess I had never had occasion to have people come care for me so much. And I was really broken and it was a real struggle. It was a really hard time. I was just doing everything to keep myself together, to be there for Craig. And people just came around me and loved me, expecting nothing in return. Neighbors I didn't even know brought me food, things like that. And I'd always, I value my relationships highly, but boy, it just was amazing to see what people would do when you were in need. And it made me so incredibly grateful. And kind of like Craig said, I feel like I've been given such a gift that he came home. I wasn't expecting him to come home. Nobody was expecting him to come home. And it's such a gift. Stupid doesn't matter anymore. Those things that used to be irritants or whatever, they truly don't matter anymore. And not that we're perfect and we don't get into dumb fights sometimes like everybody else, but it has really changed that as well. And it's funny, I'll be in church sometimes and I'll just maybe be singing a song or just be sitting there and I'll realize, oh my gosh, Craig's still here. I'm not a widow. I'm not alone. He's still here. And it is just one of the most incredible feelings. I'm so grateful for it. It is, yeah, that has changed me a lot.
Wow. So one of the things that I love that I'm super passionate about is really teaching other human beings how to connect. That's why I'm so focused on strategic storytelling and what it means to share our message and truly connect with others. But one thing that can't be taught, like here's the 3 steps, is empathy. Like you have to live through pain to experience what it's like to have empathy. So would you say that based on this situation, Karen, your empathy has gone up to the point where when you see someone going through pain, you're able to connect with that on a much higher level?
Oh, absolutely. That's a great way to put it. And absolutely. Um, yes. And I would have said before I was empathetic, but I think it's on a whole new level. Just to understand sometimes the hopelessness that people can feel and the brokenness that they can feel and the pain that they go through. And the way I saw people just gather around me. And yeah, it's made a huge difference. And I feel like as long as I live, that's a mission for me, is to be empathetic to others and to meet them in their pain and love on them and bring them the love of Christ. Honestly, that's the biggest comfort there is.
Thanks for sharing that. So let's talk about the last month, Craig. So you shared with, or Karen, you shared with us the beginning stages and then the middle, as well as Craig, kind of the mid journey. So take us through the very last month. What was happening? What was the main goal? I know that you were doing everything you could to get up and walk again. What were the main highlights of the last month that you were in the hospital?
So this was kind of funny. The goal of the LTAC was to get me strong enough to go to a rehab hospital. But the rehab hospital had to accept me. And they applied. We found a rehab hospital here in Austin. So we're going from San Antonio back to Austin. And their initial response was, no, we're not taking him. He's weak and can't do anything. Well, he's not ready to rehab. So they invited a local rep from that hospital into my room. And I didn't fully realize it at the time, but they had me going through exercises. They had me brushing my teeth and doing some different exercises to prove to this rep that I was ready for rehab. And the reality is probably a week later would have been better, but they slipped me in. And I remember going into one of my first therapy sessions. So you have 3 types of therapy. You have physical therapy, which I think everybody gets. You have occupational therapy, which I think a lot of people confuse physical therapy for occupational therapy. Think of occupational as from the waist up, physical therapy from the waist down. And then you have speech therapy, which covers a variety of things. But I'm in this group session of occupational therapy, and they have us doing these different exercises in our wheelchairs. And it's me and a bunch of old ladies. And the old ladies are kicking my butt. I'm looking like I mean, when I say old ladies, I mean old ladies. And I'm looking like a complete slacker. And there's this occupational therapist, Tanya, who's watching me. And we were supposed to do a half hour in the group, and then she was going to do a half hour with me. And her original plan was to take me into the gym. And she's sitting there watching me doing everything I can to barely move. And she comes up and she's like, we're going to do a different regimen. She takes me back to the room and has me do a variety of stretching things. My left shoulder was all locked up and could barely move. And so she spent that half hour working on that. But for the next 3 weeks, the focus was getting me to the point so I could walk and be able to walk when I came home. And it was tough. I mean, it was tough. I have pictures where my legs were just twigs because I had atrophied so much. And so the first thing they did was they got me in this machine called a standing frame, where you roll your wheelchair up to a kind of like a panel, and then literally they put your butt in a sling, and the machine lifts the sling up until you're standing. And so I would stand. It was just trying to build a little bit of muscle in my legs. And after about a week of that, then they got me walking. And then they focused on walking more and being able to take a shower and things like that. And it was a little surprising for Karen when you're in that situation, when you're in a coma for so long and you're barely moving for so long, your nervous system goes through changes. And basic sensory things were easy to send me into overload. So getting in a shower was not pleasant. It was an overloading of the senses. And it was just something I wanted to do and be done with as soon as possible because it was not the pleasant experience that you would expect. But eventually I got there and, even had to learn how to poop again and, all those things. And here's a funny story from that. So the first time I did it, and a little bit of context for those that are listening, when you lay perfectly still and you're starved, your muscles atrophy, and your core muscles, and your belly and your chest do way more for you than you realize, like helping you sit up on a toilet. And so that was hard. And the first time I tried that, it was a disaster. So the second time, Tanya, my OT, said, I tell you what, I'll make you a deal. When you get done with your business, if you stand up, I'll pull your shorts up for you. Then you sit back down in the toilet and we'll transfer you over to the wheelchair from there. Like, all right, deal. Well, I go to stand up. She pulls my shorts up and I'm looking at that wheelchair and I think, if I sit back down in the toilet, I'm just going to have to stand up again. That's work. So I start heading for the wheelchair without telling Tanya. She doesn't know what's going on. She freaks out. She grabs the only thing she can grab. Normally they have a belt around your chest that they use to keep you from falling. I didn't have that on. So she grabs the back of my shorts, yanks them up to my shoulders as she guides me into the wheelchair. I was like, Tanya, you gave me a wedgie. She's like, you didn't tell me you were going for the wheelchair. All right, fair enough. But yeah, I mean, but it was getting to that point so I could eventually come home.
So, Craig, you have military experience, you have success in business, you're an incredible author. What does this story do to your humility? Do you feel that you had a more of a sense of humility coming out of this story, hitting rock bottom, so to speak?
There was an old German lady, obese German lady in the rehab hospital with me, and I kept looking at her thinking, she will probably never walk again in her life. And there have been times since leaving the hospital, we would go to the movie theater and there was a guy who would take tickets. And originally I was still in my wheelchair and he was going out of his way to serve me. And the thing that overwhelmed me was, dude, I'm going to be out of this wheelchair in a few months. You shouldn't be serving me. You're in that forever. And it's the sense of pain, when I see somebody who may never walk again for the rest of their life for whatever reason, it's given me a lot more compassion for them. One thing I never realized, and it's funny, I try to explain it to people and they don't get it. And I wouldn't have gotten it if I hadn't gone through it. It's people don't appreciate how hard it is to get into a bathroom if you're in a wheelchair. And people are like, well, isn't the door big enough? I'm like, that's not the issue. The issue is there's this hinge on the door whose sole mission is to keep you out of the bathroom. And so in some ways, I felt like Don Quixote charging the door on the bathroom, trying to win this battle of, was I going to win over the door? And it was something I'd never seen before. And I would say that, it's given me a lot more compassion for people that are struggling with things like that.
Here's something I don't want people to miss because, the word compassion and humility, and I feel like, especially when it comes to mass media, those are not glorified attributes. I mean, you think of all the movies we've seen, especially with the main character being a businessman or woman, humility is not there, right? That doesn't, for whatever reason, Hollywood doesn't really appreciate that. But it's amazing to me because I have had the opportunity to travel all over the United States. I've spoken in most states and to all kinds of companies, different industries. And I'll tell you, it's not abnormal for me to go into a company and be in a session and not be able to identify the founder of that organization. Like, I can't tell you how many times where I'm shaking hands and someone will say, do you know who you just spoke to? I say, no. And they said, that's the person that owns the company. And I think it just speaks to just how valued humility and compassion can be, that people around you really want more of that. And sometimes we have to go through really painful situations to get to the point where we have a tremendous amount of compassion and humility. And Craig, I'm not saying that you didn't have that before you went through this experience. That's not what I'm saying. But going through an experience like that, I know for myself, like I've been through very dark moments in my life, and it gives us the opportunity to connect with others on a whole other level. So I really want people to view the word humility and compassion as really good things to have in life, to actually be humble and not think we're better than anyone. And, I'm sure when you said, older ladies are kicking your butt, I'm sure you probably remember situations like that, and not taking for granted very basic things now that you can do. So I appreciate you sharing that. So what do you want people to do with this information? So I highly recommend people read the book, right? There's many aspects that we didn't even touch on or get to because of time. But what do you want, outside of people reading the book, what do you want people to do when they even learn more about your story? How should they react to this?
Well, one thing would be for somebody who maybe is wrestling with guilt and questioning decisions they made, that they would forgive themselves. And we go into more detail in the book. There were forces working against you that you don't realize. Some of them were psychological forces just by the way the brain works in our response to authority figures. But there were also financial forces. And that's one thing that's become abundantly clear, is a lot of the decisions that were made for me that Karen agreed to, and at the time agreed, were good decisions, even when I was still awake. We didn't realize the financial incentives that were backing them, and how, and in retrospect, what bad decisions they were. And a drug that I agreed to my first day in the hospital was one of those. And so anybody that's wrestling with guilt, we want you to forgive yourself. You didn't have the information you needed to make a good decision, and there were forces working against you that would prevent you from making a good decision. The other thing would be that anybody that's wrestling with guilt for surviving, to get beyond that, and life is a gift, and live it. But you don't have to go through what I went through to believe that life is a gift. Independent of what I went through or what Karen went through, we believe your life is a gift from God, and you should live accordingly. The last thing I would say is there are some lessons that we need to learn from what we did through COVID. And we cover some of those lessons in the book, but we should learn from this so we never repeat it again.
Well, those are very powerful lessons from this story. So I appreciate you sharing that. If anyone wants to get more information on you, Craig, and you, Karen, where's the best place they can go to get that information?
So we have a website called hopethatwon'tdie.com. They can go there. The book is also on Amazon, and it's in both Kindle and paperback. And so both of those are good places to reach out.
Perfect. I'll include that in the show notes. People could just click and go to those sites. So thank you. I very much appreciate this conversation. I know there's probably brought up even more emotions based on reliving elements of the story, but it's definitely a story that needs to be shared. So I thank both of you for your time today.
Thank you, Matt.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Stories with Traction podcast. Please leave a review, since positive reviews will make it easier for others to find this conversation. Next episode will launch on Friday at 8 a.m. Eastern. Until then, remember, if you want to persuade with power and inspire those around you to action, you must share more stories.